while.
Has, yes.
Malcolm, I have to tell you, the title of this book is so brilliant because it's like Revenge of King Kong. It's fantastic. And
Pink Panther. It's a Pink Panther shout-out. Yeah.
And I have to say that one of my fondest memories at the New Yorker, and we'll go back even earlier in a moment, but at the New Yorker, you're telling me, I've written 2 pieces now, Cool Hunters and The Tipping Point. I have this idea for a book. You got an agent, the redoubtable Tina Bennett. And you thought, if I could make just a small amount of money, I could help out my family. And let's just say by the end of the day, things went well. And now 23 million books later, things have gone really well. But what interests me most is not success, material success, however deeply jealous I am. What interests me is how you invented yourself and what you do, because we have a not dissimilar background. We were both at the Washington Post, we were both at the New Yorker, and I couldn't have, in many ways, a more conventional approach to journalism. I wonder, when you look back and you were at the Spectator, you were at the Post, and then you came to the New Yorker, but something happened at a certain point that a more conventional story was left behind, and even a humorous story like the one at the Washington Post where you had a dog on death row and you treated.
Oh, that was my finest work.
It really was.
There was a dog in Bergen County. Well, should I back up and tell that story?
Sure.
I became the New York correspondent for the Washington Post, and they were uninterested in stories about New York at that point. I don't know why. And then I decided to make my life more interesting and maybe increase my profile in Washington. I would only write stories from Bergen County.
My county.
Yeah, because I decided that Bergen County was more interesting. I still believe this than New York City. So just every day I would read the Bergen County
Record.
That's right. And I saw a little tiny mention one day of a dog, an Akita named Taro, who had been confined to doggy death row. Now, doggy death row in Bergen County is in Hackensack.
Where I was born.
Were you born in Hackensack?
You bet.
There is, you think I'm joking when I say this doggy death row. No, it is actually doggy death row. You can't get there. There's like a ravine, and if you want to, you're on the other side of the ravine, and then you see a long string of cages, and then there's all these dogs who are there pending. There's all kinds of appeals, obviously, and if they lose their appeals, then they are euthanized, and they're there for biting people. And Taro, what had happened was he had been asleep, and a child, the nephew of his owner, had stumbled across him in the middle of the night on the way to the bathroom, and Taro had swiped the kid. Now, all of these claims I'm making were subject to a great amount of litigation, and had cut had cut the kid's lip. And the result was there were 7 different lawsuits. And I became convinced that Taro was wrongfully convicted. And I wrote for the Washington Post. I mean, it was thousands. It
was impressively long.
And the editor of the Washington Post, the next day after it ran, came up to me and said, that was a very good piece on Taro. It was, however, 4 times too long. Just the greatest thing anyone's ever said to me. And there were T-shirts. The owner printed up T-shirts. Free Taro. And they were distributed. And the story made the front page of the New York Post. That's the goal. That was the New York Post picked up my story.
That's the heaven.
Yeah.
That's the heaven.
So my point, so my whole strategy of conceiving of Bergen County as being a kind of more fertile ground for.
But this was rebellion. This was the beginning of the Gladwellian rebellion against the conventional, which is that New York, as I believe, is not only the most interesting place, but on certain days, the only interesting place.
Yeah.
I'm a patriot. But at what point, as we know what a Malcolm Gladwell story is, the kind of sense of surprise, playing with ideas, exploring ideas, reading social science, when did that begin to click in?
I think it starts at the Post because the problem, whenever I would take a job, you have to kind of conceive of what is the problem that you're trying to solve in this job. And the problem that I had when I got to the Post was that I was 23, and I had never written a newspaper story in my life. I had no idea how to do it. And I was surrounded by people who were the greatest, like yourself.
Yeah, yeah.
No, for those of you who don't know, David in his day was an absolutely legendary, one of the great newspaper reporters of his generation.
Thank you.
And Bob Woodward was, when I got to the Washington Post, I was in the business section. Woodward was there. And I would watch, and like Steve Call, do you remember Steve Call, who went on to become, he's still around, but he ran the Columbia Journalism School. Call, I think you told me, you pointed this out to me, when we had the push-button phones?
Yes.
He would, when I dialed, it would be like, do. Call was like, that's too slow. And he'd be like, it was like a concert pianist.
He could play a chord.
Yeah, like he'd get the White House. And it would take him like 5 seconds. I'm like, that was all. And I had the legendary Mike Isikoff was next to me. Mm-hmm. Jeff Goldberg, now editor of the Atlantic.
Some small publication in Washington, yeah.
He was an intern, and as an intern, he was better than me. He was like, he broke that legendary story. Remember when the police in Washington, D.C., lined up all of the prostitutes one night, and in the middle of the night marched them across the bridge into Virginia? Remember that?
Yeah, I do.
Goldberg, that was good. He was my roommate, and he was doing night cops, and one day he came back at like 2 o'clock in the morning. This is when D.C. was like a mess. He wakes me up. He goes, why are you here? It's like middle of the night. He goes, oh, they found a dead body in our backyard. That was like D.C., and that's what it was like. Anyway, my point is, I'm surrounded by all these people who are just better at daily journalism than I am. And so the problem was, how do you succeed in an environment whenever? And you succeed in that environment by being the thing that they are not, right? Everyone else was fast and fluid, so I decided I would be slow and weird, right? And
in fairness, the Washington Post did not prize weirdness.
No, it did not. Although the key was, the problem to be solved was, how do you stand up in an environment where everyone around you is a total pro? And so to stand out, you have to do what everyone else is not doing. So people around me were not writing 5,000-word stories on death row dogs.
No.
Now, and I don't even remember, our mutual friend Michael Spector used to refer to me as Picasso, not because I was a gifted artist, but because he felt that I was someone who labored over my prose for months and months and months before I would show it to anyone.
This is Michael Spector, who invented the phrase, after the lead, it's all typing.
It's all typing.
It's all typing.
Yeah.
Okay. A very artful approach to writing.
But when I got to the New Yorker, the problem was the opposite. Everyone was slow, so I had to be fast. Mm-hmm. Right? And I remember the first time I wrote a story for the New Yorker, I was still at the Washington Post, and I was writing the Talk of the Towns before they were signed, so that way I could freelance without them knowing. So I was writing these Talk of the Towns, and I went to see Chip McGrath. And
he was Tina Brown's deputy editor.
Yes. And Chip said, I'd written this little Talk of the Town, and he had some problem. He said, I want you to fix this problem. He said, why? And so I said, I took it from him. I said, okay, and I just wrote in the margins my fix. And I remember looking at him, and he was astonished.
Vulgarian.
It was vulgar. It was vulgar. He expected me to go home and come back in a week with the fix. I was like, no, I'll just move this here, do that. And I realized at the New Yorker, you had to be that. Otherwise, if you wanted to be slow and thoughtful and weird, then you were competing with everyone else.
Right.
Right? So I got there and I had to completely change. I had to work hard. I had to do all these things that I wasn't doing at the Washington Post.
Which piece would you say set you off? You're now at this retrospective moment in your literary journalistic life where you're writing a piece that echoes your first book, and you're no longer 23 years old.
Yeah.
I mean, there must be some sense of self-examination about this.
It was probably a piece called The Cool Hunt. Remember The Cool Hunt?
I do.
Where I don't know how I found her. A woman who's still a very good friend of mine, Dee Dee Gordon, who went around. whose business was going around America telling corporations what was cool.
T-shirts and the like.
T-shirts. And she was, and still is, absolutely hilarious.
How'd you find her?
I can't remember. I used to go out to LA a lot, and she lived on top of Beechwood Canyon. Madonna was 2 doors down, and her house was owned by the drummer from Bread. Remember Bread?
I do. I'm not proud of it, but I remember.
She had a vintage Camaro and a dog named Sage, a small terrier named Sage. And I convinced her, she was constantly going to Japan, because at the time that's where you went when you were a cool hunter. And so I said, oh, so you must be, what happens to Sage? She goes, I find a dog sit. I was like, I will dog sit Sage. So I moved to LA for huge chunks of time. And anyway, I wrote a piece about her, about this idea that she would just go around and she would declare something cool and she would tell you what was, and
companies would hire her
hire her. But the whole point of that piece was the title, The Cool Hunt. Once you had the title, it's like, and there was, someone wanted to make a movie out of it. Of course, nothing ever came of it. But it was the first time I realized, like that was, that kind of.
It was something else.
There was something fun about being interested in pop culture for the New Yorker, and.
Did the New Yorker never have that kind of thing before? Now this kind of story comes up.
Yeah.
But was that an absence that you were filling, a vacuum?
Well, no, I didn't know anyone else in the New Yorker. It was the same thing about trying to be different. So I didn't know of anyone else who was writing about. Dee Dee Gordon was not the typical subject of a New Yorker profile.
No.
I mean, she was this kind of strange, hilarious. She had this crazy crush on Keanu Reeves. She was obsessed with Keanu Reeves. I just remember, and she just she was convinced she was going to marry him somehow in the most charming way. I adore Dee Dee to this day. She's just fantastic. But I just thought, like, this is different in a way. This will stand out. You just needed to stand out.
And then you did The Tipping Point, which is now associated with you. But as you've said repeatedly, what you were doing is taking an idea that was very much in the air, in sociological terms, in terms of crime and much else. How did you approach that?
Well, I was very interested in. I'd come to New York just when I arrived in New York. New York was still the dangerous, scary place.
96?
I came in 93, and then. Remember, that was right when the crime declines starts. And
93 you came to the Post, and then 96 to the New Yorker.
Yeah, so I'm there. When I get there, it's dirty and dangerous. And then, by the end of the 90s, it's the safest big city in the country. And I could not get over that. I just thought this was the single most interesting thing. And I remember I did this little podcast on this. But there was a moment, I used to live in a walk-up on Bank Street, and I was on the 5th floor. My bedroom opened onto the fire escape. And when I got to New York, I was too terrified to open. There was no air conditioning. I didn't want to open my window at night because it was off the fire escape, and I was terrified someone would come in. And then I remember there just came a moment when I had my window open all night. I didn't worry about it anymore. And in retrospect, I was like, wow, that's bizarre. I got here 3 years ago, and I was terrified of opening my window, and now I'm not. I just wanted to explain that. Nobody was explaining it to me. And to this day, people are still kind of wrestling with what happened. But so then I just remember I used to go to Boeb's library at NYU because it was pre-Google. And you had to go through the stacks looking for ideas. And I was in the HM1A6 aisle, which is where the American Journal of Sociology back issues were. And I ran across an article from 1991 by Jonathan Crane, which was all about the epidemic theory of the ghetto or something. It's all about how teenage pregnancy and juvenile delinquency follow the pattern of epidemics. And I had just been writing about, I wrote about the AIDS epidemic for the Washington Post. So I knew all these epidemiologists, I knew epidemiology. And here was a guy taking epidemiology and applying it to social problems. And I was like, oh, that's what happened in New York. And I just remember sitting there, it's like, oh, that's it. And then I wrote that article, and that article led to the book. I was the kind of, I remember I was standing in the stack.
So what was the idea for the book? You had these two pieces. And how did you cast out what the book, what it would be, what shape it would take, what voice it would have?
Well, I didn't. My agent came, Tina, who I knew socially, and then she became an agent. She was just like she worked in the admissions department of some.
She'd been a graduate student in history.
Yeah.
In literature.
I just knew she's friends of friends, and then she became an agent. She's like, "Can I be your agent?" I was like, "I guess, sure." And then she's now like the powerhouse of powerhouses. But I knew her, and she said, "You should write a book on this." And I.
But what is this?
The article, The Tipping Point.
Yeah.
Because people got really interested in it, and I started like, someone in California flew me out to speak to their group about it. I remember thinking that was really weird, that a piece in New Yorker could, so I thought, oh, maybe people are kind of into this. And Tina's like, yeah, you should do a book. So I knew the article in the New Yorker was a chapter, clearly a chapter, or part of a chapter, and then I had to kind of improvise. I'd never written a book before. I had to kind of
Now, but before we get to the way you reconsider the idea, because it's a very interesting bridge, I want to know, it probably is not in the stack of cards here, I want to know how you invented yourself as a voice and how naturally or not that came to me, because I can read a paragraph of yours or a page of yours and I know it right away that's you. There's a certain cadence, there's a certain way that chapters end. There are moves that are as distinctive as somebody's, a piano player or an athlete. You watch enough athletes, you listen to enough music. There's a Gladwell cadence, there's a Gladwell sense of humor. It's very, very distinctive. How self-aware are you of it? How did it become itself?
Well, it's hard to say. So I spent 10 years at the Post, and there's something, I think that's crucial, because what happens at the Post is you learn how to write, meaning you learn how to write without fear and self-consciousness. You're forced to. And I remember by the end of my time at the Washington Post, I remember when I was one of the last stories I wrote before I left for the New Yorker, there was a shooting on the LIRR, and it happened at like 4:30 in the afternoon. And back then the deadline was like 6:30.
Yeah, right.
So I get on the LIRR and I go out to the scene. I get there at like 5:30, and it's clearly a front page story. And they're like, "We need the story."
And there's a shooting on the Long Island Railroad is a front page story in the Washington Post?
It was a big shooting.
Ah.
It was like serious. It's going to be. Well, I mean, my assumption was,
right.
I was telling them, of course, it's a front page story. That's the way it worked. This is huge.
Hold the
never
front
happened
page.
before.
Yeah.
Someone got shot in New York City. Hold the front page. It's above the fold. Like the whole nine. You know this. You did this drill yourself many, many times.
Oh my God, yeah.
Yeah.
And you could do it from Moscow, and you could just, they all get nervous.
Michael Spector used to, his colleague of ours, was so good at this. He would do a kind of salami slicing where he'd take a story and do 10 stories out of it, and each one would get on the front page, because it would be like, it's changed. Yesterday I said, there's another wrinkle. And they'd be like, oh my God. And they put the first wrinkle on the front page. They put the second wrinkle, and then there's day 3, oh my God. Anyway, I go out there, I'm on the LAR, and I remember this is when I was at the peak of my powers. So I interviewed all these people. I don't have time to, there's no laptops back then. There's no and I did the thing which I had heard, hard-bitten newspaper reporters.
You dictated.
I picked up the phone and I called it in. I remember that feeling of I dictated a 1,500-word story into the phone to someone typing on the other end, straight through. And I was so pleased with myself. But I realized at that moment, I got nothing else to learn here. But that's what you learn. And that, you never lose that fluidity. So in other words, every bad habit you have as a writer gets beaten out of you at a newspaper, because it's just discipline. It's like, boom, tell the story tell it in a way that's compelling.
Yeah, but something happens to your prose, and I won't linger on this too long, but if I read Anthony Lane, for example, I can read him, and I know that, obviously, Anthony is an incredibly erudite reader and writer, but I know that he did not get through life without reading P.G. Wodehouse over and over again. That informs the texture of this tapestry. Who was that for you? Or was it just the newspaper business?
Well, no. So then I get to, I think I have a little bit of that at the Post, but it gets, my point is you get pared down, you get rid of all your bad habits, and then you have, it's like, you know, in playing a musical instrument, you spend the first 10 years mastering the fundamentals, and then you're free to develop some kind of stuff. You know, but you have to do the compulsory, you know, work to kind of, and that's what the Post is. You get reduced to the simplest essence of how to tell a story, and now you have the freedom, and you come to a lot of it was Adam Gopnik. So I was reading Gopnik long before I joined the New Yorker, and Gopnik has an exceedingly distinctive voice, right? And a beautiful way of expressing himself, and there's little kind of beautiful little frill. I mean, his prose sings, his little choruses and frills, and it's just like, and reading that, you know, I'm half a generation.
But his move is, he has many, but what is the pop culture, or boomer pop culture, as he and I have discussed, but reference when discussing something like, you know, Nietzsche or the French Revolution.
That's crucial. So this reminds me of something. When I was in middle school, I met my lab partner was a guy named Terry Martin, who you know of Terry Martin, now a Soviet scholar. But he, by happenstance, in our little town in Canada, he was my lab partner. And Terry was an absolutely brilliant guy. And we were in biology together, and we would do these experiments. And he would always refuse to do the experiment the way we were supposed to do it, like as a matter of principle. And I remember at first utterly horrified, because we couldn't finish anything. Yeah. Nothing was ever handed in. We would always get terrible grades. And then about by kind of November of 7th grade, I realized it's genius. Because what he taught me was that you have the freedom. I mean, he wasn't being destructive or nihilistic. He was like saying, okay, so they're all going to do it this way, but we don't have to do it that way. There's another way to learn what's going on here. He was deeply interested in biology.
This is what so interests me. So play is what you use the word, and I think it even causes some people alarm, or they're offended intellectually or otherwise, or they're jealous or whatever it is. You use the phrase playing with ideas as if this is to them somehow irresponsible. What does playing with ideas mean?
It begins with Terry in 7th grade. It is having the confidence that you can.
But what does that mean? That he would dissect a frog with a buzzsaw or something? I mean,
No, it was chemistry, not biology. I realize now it was chemistry with Mr. Cummings. I think Mr. Cummings or Mr. Picard. I forgot. It was.
They'll never know.
They'll never know. No, it was a kind of like, and then we went on, because Terry and I, then we developed this deep friendship, and we would play endless games of Monopoly, and we then deregulated Monopoly. And our idea was the rules, at that point we were like, well, the rules make no sense. Like, the game, it's a brilliant game, but for example, why do you start with $1,500? That is, by the way, if you're interested, this is the great flaw with Monopoly. Because the point of Monopoly is, when you're playing it, it should be a question of what can I afford? It should be a difficult question. I land on Marvin Gardens. Do I want to buy Marvin Gardens? Should be a question that you have to entertain and come up with a serious answer to. If you give each player $1,500 to start and you land on Marvin Gardens, you just buy it. How is that interesting? That's absurd.
So it's a little bit like inherited wealth.
Yes, exactly. So we started with $1. And
What could you buy with $1?
No. So
you can't even get a slice of pizza.
No.
Much less Marvin Gardens.
So the first 10 minutes is just speed circling the board, accumulating capital. and then we had to come up with all kinds of ways to basically create systems for creating leverage.
Did you have too much time on your hands?
No. We played so much Monopoly. So what I realize now is that we would sell derivatives. So I would say, like if I landed on your property, you had improved, the blue property, Vermont and Oriental and whatever. I owe you $500. We'd never pay the $500. That was silly. Why would you pay the $500? Instead, it should be an invitation to a negotiation about, I owe you $500. All right, so how can I be useful to you in some other way, right?
So it's goods and services.
Yeah. You land on Vermont, you owe me $500. I have Broadway, I need Park Place. So I say, okay, pay me $100, but if you land on Park Place, I have the right of first refusal to buy that property from you, right? Now that's a simple example. We constructed these insanely elaborate, massive derivatives, and we would play.
Did they have no drugs in Canada?
We would play with Terry's cousin Fred, and we would play like 3 or 4 games an afternoon, and we would play hundreds of games a summer. We would get together every morning and just play this game. And but it was the same thing. It was like, and each, over the course of the summer, we would create ever more elaborate structures around. But that's the origin of play. Because Terry's assumption, this is what Terry taught me. He was like, what does Parker Brothers know about Monopoly? The self-confidence of that was so brilliant.
Fair enough. But when you're dealing with auto safety, medical tests, all the many subjects. In other words, at what point do you feel grimly responsible toward the set of ideas and the facts? And how does that interact with playing? What's the difference between what you're doing and what an academic feels obliged to do?
Because
I remember reading a piece of yours, and there was a piece, and it was so mean to Ralph Nader, who I was
so great,
who I was brought up to think was just an incredible hero for all. Okay, he lost the election at one point, but never mind. But
I can tell you where that came from. So this goes to your
and
point.
then you blamed poor Ralph Nader for what?
Oh, it's so genius. So on the sense of play, the first layer of play is understanding other people who want to play, right? So I like cars, and I thought it'd be fun to write about automobile safety for the New Yorker, because nobody was writing about automobiles. And if they were writing about it, they were writing about it in this kind of really kind of rote, boring.
Right.
So find someone who has an interesting take on auto safety. Now, where would that person reside? Well, not in academia. They would work for a car company, right? Turns out there's a Scottish guy called Leonard Evans who ran the safety department at General Motors. And Leonard wrote a book called Traffic Safety in America, which is so genius. And I read Traffic Safety. I was like, oh, my God, Leonard, you're a genius. So I call up Leonard. And he's got this whole Scottish brogue accent.
And he's been waiting for you all his life.
He has been waiting for me his entire life. No journalist has ever called Leonard.
Of course not.
And Leonard's sitting in his office in Dearborn, wherever the hell he is. And he doesn't even bother to clear it with General Motors public relations because he's never had a journalist call him before. He's just on the phone with me. And Leonard does something. By the way, Leonard gave me a Pulitzer, and I would have won the Pulitzer Prize. And I didn't, I neglected. So Leonard, the first story Leonard gives me, he goes, in his Scottish accent, which I can't do, he says, you realize, we're talking about airbags. And this is in the mid-90s, late 90s. And one of Leonard's points was, airbags were suddenly a big deal. Everyone was in love with airbags. And his point was, the airbag, if you're not wearing your seatbelt, the airbag can kill you, particularly if you're very young or very old or very small. And Leonard said, the reason we don't realize this is that the reason we have airbags is because of Ralph Nader. And Ralph Nader didn't understand this fact, and he was promoting the airbag he thought it was an alternative to the seatbelt, as opposed to an accompaniment to the seatbelt. And then Leonard said, and I never wrote about this, he said, what you should do is you should file a Freedom of Information Act request with whatever the transit automobile bureaucracy is, and ask for all the cases of people who died because they weren't wearing a seatbelt and the airbag went off. And that's the blood that's on Ralph Nader's hands. And I was like, oh my God. So I filed a FOIA request, and like 2 months later, like 7 huge boxes show up at the Washington Post, and it's all the case files. What did I do with that story? Nothing. And then, so I remember this, and I remember Leonard, and I get to the New Yorker, and I'm filled with shame that I never wrote the story. I would have won the Pulitzer Prize. I would have won the... Leonard gave me a Pulitzer Prize. It was all there in the boxes. It was like hundreds of people. I mean, it's sad. It's not, but like...
He did say it was sad. Hashtag sad.
Sad. And Leonard is not happy with me for not doing a story about this. So then I say, okay, Leonard, I'll do the Ralph Nader story. I'm not deployed now. The ship has sailed, but we'll do the Ralph Nader story. Yeah. And then I go, so then, for some reason, I go to Detroit, but I don't hang out with Leonard. I hang out with his competitor at Ford. And I think he got very concerned about that. Yeah. He was unhappy. But the guy at Ford had this whole thing about 3-point belts, and we crashed all these cars. It was so much fun. And then so I came back. But the point, it all starts with Leonard. Like, Leonard was a guy who wanted to play. He was an iconoclast, ignored, sitting in his office in Dearborn, and nobody was listening to him. And he was writing these books that were read by 7 people. And he was just great. He was just like, and when you uncover someone like that, and he was just so thrilled with the idea that...
I think another thing that thrilled you is that all the rest of us slobs who are writing about politics or show business or sports are obsessed with access, right? You want to write a profile of LeBron James. You want to write a profile of Kamala Harris or whatever. And you have to go through these tentacles and seaweed of handlers and no, and can we have quote approval and photo approval? And the answer is no, okay, we're not, blah, blah, blah. It's terrible. It's terrible. And I think part of it, and tell me if I'm wrong, was your antipathy to that.
Yeah.
I mean, the closest I think you might have done to a true celebrity profile, one of my favorite pieces, was the guy who was the Ronco, what was it called? The Ronco jar and bottle cutter?
Oh, that's one of my favorite pieces of all, that I ever did. On the guy who did the Showtime rotisserie.
But that's related, the rotisserie chicken guy.
Yeah.
But what I gleaned from that also, you had a very early interest, and here we're going back a little bit, before you were in journalism, you were in advertising. What was your...
Well, I wanted to be in advertising. I think they couldn't get a job.
You couldn't get a job?
No,
Why did you want to be in advertising?
Well, because I liked the idea that someone can tell a story in 30 seconds. I just thought that was fantastic. And I was in awe of... I thought the greatest achievement was a well-told 30-second story was the hardest thing in the world. And the idea that they can make you laugh or cry in 30 seconds while they're selling you something is just... the degree of difficulty on that is just off the charts.
Well, so
hence, I wanted to do that.
Hence, what was his name? The Ronco jar and bottle?
So Ron Popeil.
Ron Popeil.
He did the... Remember, he used to do the late-night infomercials. He was the infomercial king.
Right.
And he made a number of things, but his showpiece product was the Showtime rotisserie oven, which was, I claim, dollar for dollar, the finest kitchen appliance ever made. And I still believe that to be the case. And I went out to LA, and I hung out with Ron, and I decided to go deep on Ron. And it turns out he's from, like, Asbury Park or somewhere in... His people were all, they were...
Tumblers. They were salesmen.
On the boardwalk in New Jersey. They all sold like knives and stuff on the boardwalk. And Ron was another guy, Ed McMahon was part of that circle. And a guy named Kidders Morris, who was Ron Popeil's grandfather, was a legendary guy from the old country who came over and was selling kitchen gadgets on the boardwalk. And they would do the spiel. And the chop, chop, chop. They'd have all the vegetables, and they'd be sitting on the boardwalk, and they would show you the knife, and they'd go chop, 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 chop. And the whole thing was the turn. this is a crucial thing that he learns back then, which is, so the crowd gathers around you and you got the ginsu knife and you're chopping the vegetables. And then at a certain, first of all, he taught me this. He's like, you got the carrots and the potatoes and you got the pineapple. You can't ever chop the pineapple.
Why?
Because it's so expensive. It's just there. It's the thought that he might somehow one day chop the pineapple that keeps the people coming. But no, you chop the carrots. The carrots are like 5 cents a carrot. But the key thing is the turn. So the people come close, they gather around you. You're going chop, 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 chop. And you got to sell them the knife, and they got to get out of there. Because the new people have to come in. That's the key. So that anybody can do the thing, chop, 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 chop. People gather around, blah, blah, blah. But it's turning that crowd and bringing in a new one in a seamless fashion. And Ron was battle-tested on the board. He was the greatest of all the boardwalk. And then he goes to L.A., and he takes it up a notch, and he starts doing late-night infomercials. And he was so good. And I hung out with him, and I was out there for like 2 weeks, mostly goofing around. But and I talked with the guy who he collaborated with on the Showtime oven. I actually for years, I used to cook my chickens on the Showtime. It was amazing.
No more?
I don't know what happened. It got really squeaky in like year 6.
You had a squeaky rotisserie.
I had a squeaky one, and Ron told me that I had to fix it, and
You threw it out.
But his big thing was...
You threw out the oven.
Yeah, I did. His big thing that, a lot of back then in the old days, the rotisseries, they went like this. Like, this is the spit.
Vertical.
They were vertical. And Ron's like, why do you do it vertical? It makes no sense. The juices flow to the bottom. Crazy. It's got to be horizontal. He's the guy who starts the horizontal rotisserie. And getting into the family history, and at one point he takes me to the gravesite in New Jersey where there's 3 generations of these legendary pitchmen who worked the boardwalk, and they're all buried in this thing. And he starts to cry, and it was just like, it was just unbelievable. But the move there, and my editor, your dear friend, Henry Finder, he was another very formative figure in this. He's like, the standard move is to make fun of Ron Popeil. Do not make fun of Ron Popeil. You have to genuinely, he's a hero. Mm-hmm. You have, and if the reader thinks for a moment you're mocking the man, you've failed. And that is the single greatest advice.
I'm 100% with Henry on that.
100%.
Yeah.
And to this day, people make this error, journalists do. They think at some point they have to demonstrate their superiority to the subject. Yep. No. The subject is the hero. And you have to find your job. There's 10 ways to write that. Ron Popeil had a very complicated
Except in political reporting, but okay.
Yeah. Well, but Ron there's 10 ways to write the Ron Popeil profile. 9 of those ways you make fun of him.
Thank you.
And one way you look for what was fantastic about this guy, which is he devoted his life, and his people, for 3 generations, devoted his life to working in the kitchen a happier, healthier, easier, more efficient. That's a fantastic. He cared about whether the chicken was vertical or horizontal.
One of the interesting things about the new book is that and you've always done this to one degree or another, you reassess what you said earlier. You try to explore if I've made a mistake, or if there were mistakes in the things that you were relying on or exploring in this. You reassess. And one of the central parts of the tipping point was the broken windows theory. Tell us about that and how you've reassessed that and why.
So I actually have a podcast episode very explicitly on this that's coming out maybe next week. So in one of the sort of central chapters of the original tipping point is this trying to tell the story of crime decline. And I was writing that in the late 90s. Giuliani is still mayor. And Giuliani and Bratton are telling this story about...
Bill Bratton, the police commissioner.
About broken windows. And their expression, which is this idea that if you want to stop large crimes, you have to stop small crimes. and they were trying to restore the civility of the city.
The squeegee man,
Yes, the squeegee man, the guy urinating on the sidewalk, all that kind of stuff. And the essence of what they were saying, I think, was correct, which was you can't live in a city that is disorderly will die. If everyone is jumping the turnstile in the subway will cease to function as a civilized place. I think that is absolutely correct. But they went 2 steps further. First step, they said, was the way to stop that kind of disorder was just to arrest everyone in sight. And the second step, they said, was, and by doing that, we will also make a huge dent in violent crime. And that was the connection that I accepted and endorsed in the original. It was steps 2 and 3 that I endorsed in the original tipping
Which
point.
became Stop and Frisk.
Became Stop and Frisk. And Stop and Frisk, after my book comes out, we have this thing that happens, Stop and Frisk ramps up and ramps up and ramps up to the point where by 2010, 2011, we are stopping, I believe in 1 year, 2012, 700,000, mostly young men of color, are stopped in New York City in a single year, right? And in 1.5% of those cases, they're finding something on them of trouble. The whole thing, it was bananas. But everyone was convinced that that's what was keeping crime down. Then there's that famous case, the Floyd case, where God bless her, like the most badass, liberal, progressive judge in New York, throws the thing out, and everyone braces and says it's unconstitutional. And even she says in her opinion that she was really worried crime was going to go back up, but you can't do that, right? Mm-hmm. So everyone was bracing, it's all going to come back. And then what happens is, and this is the part of the New York crime story that everyone has forgotten, the great New York City crime decline is not 1993 to 2010. It's 2010 to 2019. After they stop and frisk, and they go from 700,000 stops a year to like 20,000, crime declines another 50%. That's when New York becomes Paris. By 2019, New York City is Paris. It's so unbelievable. And every other big city in this country declines in the 90s. And then they go flat, they flatline.
Why did the decline continue?
The decline, it's the second decline that's the amazing decline. And it declines because the cops, the NYPD does a complete about-face, learns their lesson, and realizes that criminality is not something that is inherent in the broad class of young men of color in the Bronx and Brooklyn. Criminality is something that is confined to incredibly specific subpopulations of the city that we can identify, and if we just use our...
In very specific places.
Yes, if we use precision policing, we can make... And it turns out that is absolutely correct and makes...
And it's a universal?
When you say universal...
Beyond New York.
If other cities had followed the same strategy, they would have had a similar success. But it's something that is pioneered in New York in the second half of the aughts. The rest of the country is kind of catching up. But for example, they realized it's an incredible statistic that they would do these. They would spend months planning these very specific takedowns of criminal gangs operating around public housing developments in Brooklyn and the Bronx. And in the aftermath of those specific targeted campaigns, the murder rate citywide would drop by 35%.
Citywide.
Yeah, insane.
Yeah.
And that's why no one talks about, like, I can't stress enough by 2019 how safe the city it is. Any criminologist you talk to will say what happened between 2012 and 2019 is the single most extraordinary urban transformation of our lifetime. Like, it's unbelievable. It makes no sense that we were, and like, what's incredible as well is that...
And yet, if you listen to the Republican candidate for president...
This drives me crazy.
You would think we live in...
Do you know, all the hedge
hell
fund
on
guys,
earth.
this drives me, the hedge fund guys who leave in, like, I can't deal with the crime in New York anymore, man, I'm moving to Miami. Miami has twice the violent crime of New York City. If they were really worried, they would sell the place in Coral Gables and move to the Bronx. That is, and like, J.D. Vance has this tweet about, like, I'm going, in like 2019, another one of the, I'm going to New York City, I hear it's dangerous and
Wish
violent.
me well, yeah.
The violent crime in Cincinnati is where he's from, 3x We should be tweeting, I'm going to Cincinnati, JD, where should I stay? I hear it's violent and dangerous there. Like, just this fantasy that is completely disconnected with...
You are no longer 23, and you've just had a couple of kids. They're how old now?
I got a toddler and a baby.
Yeah.
I'm forbidden to give their real name.
And you're 60?
Are you
You look like you're
how old I am?
14. First of all, good luck. Second of all, famously, and you once told me, you know how you did one of your moves about college admissions.
I love
It's
that.
crazy. They're getting in, and the 92nd Street Y kindergarten, and Ivy League this, and da-da-da. In Canada, we just filled out an application the night before, and da-da-da. Okay. All right.
No, not even the night before.
Well, you the morning of.
Day of. David, my parents weren't even involved. My father asked me, where are you applying to college? I was like,
day.
well, I'm just doing the form now.
And what did you put on it? Monopoly?
No, you just...
What the hell did you do in high
You just send
school?
the form in. It's like a page. You just send it in.
All right. So your kids are going to not stay toddler and baby for very long. I promise you that. This is one area where I know more. How are you going to feel about college admissions when they get to be 16, 17, 18? Because your rant about Ivy League...
Which I've been doing for years.
It's one of the most perfected rants of all time.
I got a new rant, by the way. I got 2 episodes of my podcast. So I've been working on this rant, you're right. 15 years. I got 2 episodes of my podcast coming out, I think next week. It's called The Georgetown Massacre. It is, when I say this is like, it is my Beethoven's Fifth. It is my White Album. It is everything else I have done.
This is what's going on.
It's just like chump change compared. This is 2 parts. 2 parts on one case involving a tennis player who goes to Georgetown. And everything I've done as a writer has been building towards, it's so genius. And by the end, it's just like, and it has twists and turns, and it's just,
Would you like to preview it?
No, I don't want to give it away. You got to listen to it. I'm not giving it away. So good. No, but
This is why I have to work for a living.
No, I know what you're saying. Am I going to be a hypocrite?
Yeah.
Of course. What? The one thing I will not do, though.
Yeah, what?
There was one place where I believe.
Where are you going to draw the line? SAT prep?
No, I'm not making the call.
Oh, okay. You mean the call to the Macher call?
You call in. I know the guy who knows the guy who knows the guy who's on the board. Not doing that.
Okay.
I say.
We talked about voice before, and one of the reasons I think that your podcast is so successful and so seductive, and I don't miss them, is that it has a real human voice. It doesn't feel read, even though I know damn well that you've worked on them really hard. Similar to your prose. It feels, your written prose feels spoken and vice versa, which I mean is high praise. Podcasting is a relatively new form. Why did you gravitate toward it in such a complete way? This is not some avocation. In fact, at a certain point, you've done work where the book is an extension of the podcast, as with the Bomber book. So tell me about that and your attraction to it.
Well, there's certain kinds of stories. So, for example, the story I was just talking about, the Georgetown Massacre. You could write it, but it's not nearly as fun in written form.
Right.
So there's a certain kind of story which lends itself beautifully to audio, where audio permits you could be more playful. You can get away with stuff.
What does that mean?
Get away with stuff.
Yeah.
There's no critical infrastructure. So there's no one's going to...
I don't understand. You can be more full of shit?
No, you couldn't be like...
You have to be... You're careful. I mean,
Yeah, I am. No, we're not making stuff up.
Right.
What I'm saying is, people are more accepting of a kind of playful outlandishness. So, part of the Georgetown Massacre episodes, the tongue is in the cheek, right? Even as I'm making a substantive point.
and you feel you can do that more than in Caslon type in a certain magazine.
You would not let me write that for the New Yorker. You take it out.
Because I would feel what?
It wouldn't work. It's like, it's hard to explain, because a lot of what's playful about audio is stuff you're doing with your voice, right? So I can adopt a tone of voice that says, we're
kidding
messing
around. We're having fun.
Right.
We're playing
Or
with
you
ideas.
Yeah, like there's a character in the Georgetown Massacre. It's part of it was a turn, and we meet there's a guy who's charged in a case, and he takes as his lawyers the two greatest defense lawyers in the country, Roy Black and Howard Shrebnick, these two guys in Miami. And we meet Roy and Howard. Now, the first crucial thing is, if I'm writing a print version, you'll meet Roy and Howard. I describe them, you got to hear, when you hear them, it's just so much better. And you realize, and then when you're describing them, I can describe them in a much more colorful way when I know you're going to hear their voice, right? I can't explain it better than that, but there is something about, Howard has got long hair and rides a motorcycle in the early morning hours and looks like a movie star and does this, in this trial, he does a direct examination of the defendant's daughter that is just so masterful. I mean, it's like, and I was reading, you read the transcript. The transcripts are thousands of pages. And you come to this thing and you're like, as someone, because people like you and I, our business fundamentally is not about, we're not in the writing business, we're in the interviewing business, right? We only write because we've interviewed somebody. It's really interviewing.
You think of it that way?
Oh, yeah.
Really?
Oh, yeah. The whole game is interviewing. It's not.
Okay.
Writing is, I would never write something without it. The idea of writing something just without having sat down first to talk to someone is unthinkable to me.
Right.
So when a defense lawyer is.
But just to stipulate, that's the fun part for you? That's the juice of it, above all?
Well, I don't find the writing part hard. I find the writing part is just, it's just a matter of sitting down and
Wow. Don't tell any writers that.
No, but that's the gift of being at the Washington Post for 10 years. It used to be hard, and it wasn't. By the time I was done there, I was on the phone dictating the story. They solved that problem. The hard part is, can I sit down with somebody and can I understand who they are and what they're trying to say and represent that in a way that's meaningful and powerful? And all of that is stuff you get from the interview. You can't make it up after the fact. So you have to, I was doing, this summer I spent like 20 hours, maybe I've forgotten how many hours, 10, 15, 20 hours with this woman who's a psychologist. And it was incredible. She agreed, thank God, to sit with me for that long.
Who is this?
I'm telling you, Steve.
Oh.
You're like the competition, for goodness sake.
That hurts me very much.
You'd be like, getting the phone and, no, I'm not, it's a great story, it's a fantastic story. But
You're not even paying me here. Tell me.
No, not telling you. Not telling you. And it was the same thing with the Paul Simon thing that we did.
Yeah, I've heard of him.
Where he sat for 40 hours. And the whole thing, what's interesting, what's hard about that was not writing it up afterwards. All those problems were solved in the interview. The trick was, when we were talking to him.
Sorry to interrupt, which is the worst thing you can do in an interview, but I've interviewed Paul Simon. He's not immediately easy.
No, he's not easy. And
you had him for, on and on and on, and it got richer and richer and richer. And something you did, something about you, your patience, your interest, your silence, whatever it was, drew out a guy that I think it's fair to say is not immediately thrilled with the process of being interviewed.
I don't understand why he was so, I kept on saying, I'm done. And then he would say, no, when are we meeting again? And me and Bruce, my friend Bruce did it together. And Bruce and I would look at each other
Bruce Headlam.
Yeah. Bruce and I would look at each other like, he really wants to do it again? And he would always do it again. And then,
I couldn't believe it.
yeah, I don't know part of it was, Bruce is a real musician. So if I'd been doing it by myself, I'm not a real musician. And I feel like if you're going to talk to a musician, having someone who Bruce could talk real music with him, and that put him at ease. And I think that, if I was kind of reconstructing why he was so kind of generous with his time, that would be part of it. Part of it was, I think, we were uninterested in the parts of his life that he felt had been picked over. So we're not interested in your marriage to so-and-so.
In relationship with Art Garfunkel.
But we were really interested in his dad. And I remember there was one moment we were...
Who was a musician.
Who was a musician. I remember there was one time where Bruce and I asked him some question, and I asked him some question about his dad. And he talked straight for like half an hour, got incredibly emotional, and then he said, I have to stop, and he got up and walked outside. It was like...
Wow.
There was something really deep. And the idea, it's so interesting, and that moment when you're interviewing somebody, first of all, it never gets old. When you tap into something, so we had tapped into something that was real about him, that his relationship to his father, he's a man in his 70s, his father's been dead for 30 years. He eclipsed his father in every conventional way by a million miles. And yet, and you realize he was still writing about his father. He was still dreaming about his father. His father was still like with him. It was just such a kind of like, but that, when you get there, and that took a long time for us to get there. When you get there with somebody, like I said, the writing is not hard when you get that kind of moment on the.
How did your parents affect the way you look? You're now at you're moving forward, but slightly retrospective. You have kids, your life has changed. You look back on it, how did your parents inform who you are in your work?
Well, my dad was a mischief maker. He was someone who had no interest whatsoever in any authority, in any. He did not. The psychological term that best describes him was disagreeable. Not. The psychologists, when they use the term, they don't mean obnoxious. He was the furthest thing from obnoxious. Incredibly gracious man. In psychological terms, disagreeable means you are uninterested in the approval of others. Could care less. Just the idea of standing out and being different was just second nature for him. It wasn't that he relished that being different. It's just he didn't care. He just did what he wanted.
How was he different? He taught math.
Taught math. He was a kind of. I've told the story many times, but we moved to Canada. We're living in rural Canada in kind of Mennonite country. It was all these old order Mennonites, people who are like the Amish. They're driving buggies, and a barn would burn down, and they would do a barn raising. They'd all gather the next day, and they would raise the barn in one day. Hundreds of Mennonites would come in their horses and buggies from miles around, and they would, have a huge spread of food, and they would just, it was incredible to watch, actually, if you go to a barn raising. Hundreds of them putting up a barn. And my father decided to join. And so there's one car, a kind of, his Volvo, with like 100 horses and buggies. And he's like an English guy. They're all like clean shaven, wearing black pants and like these, and hats, straw hats. And he's like got a big beard and a tie. And he looks like a mathematician, an English mathematician. And he drives up in his Volvo with his kids in tow. And not an ounce of self-consciousness. Not even did it even occur to him to ask permission to show up. He shows up and says, basically, put me to work. And they're like, okay. And he doesn't know they're doing, so he's doing the most manual labor. None of the 100 people at this barn raising had more than a 6th grade education. He has a PhD in advanced mathematics, and he's the happiest man there. That's so my dad. He was just went home and then never spoke about it again. Or my other favorite story about my dad, a story he told me when he was in his 70s. I don't know why I never told him this before. He's married my mom. My mom is Jamaican. They're in Jamaica. He's teaching at the University of West Indies, where one of his students is Kamala Harris's dad. And he decides he wants to write, he's writing some paper, and back then, if you needed a book, the book he needed was not in the University of West Indies library. And he figures out it's at the Georgia Tech library. And so he's going to go to Georgia Tech. And so he writes a letter to the professor, friend he knows at Georgia Tech. My name is Graham Gladwell. I'm a professor at the University of West Indies. I would like to come to Georgia Tech to use your library. Guy says yes. And he's preparing to go. And he learns later that it kicks off a panic at Georgia Tech because it's 1960. Georgia Tech is segregated. And they don't know whether he's white or black. They just know he's a professor from the University of West Indies. God knows he could be a black guy coming to our campus. We just invited a black guy to the campus. Holy shit. And they go nuts. And finally, there's telephones, but there's no direct line. They try and find out. Finally, they reach him on the phone before he's about to come. And, he's called to the switchboard, whatever. Professor Gladwell, yes. This is so-and-so from Georgia Tech, yes. Are you white? He goes, yes. And they go, oh, thank God. So then, but this is the story's not over. So then, they're going to roll out the red carpet, right? But so he gets on the boat, sails from Jamaica to Miami, gets on the bus. That's how you did it back then. Takes the bus from Miami to Atlanta, goes, they have a welcome dinner. They're all sitting down, all like these white men, right? And halfway through the meal, he pulls out a large 8x10 photo of my mom. Says, yes, my wife. I was going to bring her, but I decided against it. Hands it around the room. No, to him, that was a fantastic moment. Show these guys. Never mentioned a word about that story for 40 some odd years. And then he's like, oh, I went to Georgia Tech, and I had interviewed some guy there who was the head of the political science department, who was a black guy from Atlanta. And I told it to my dad, and my guy's like, oh, that's so funny. It wasn't always that way. And then he tells the story. But that was so him. He loved nothing more than poking the bear. But he didn't make a big deal about it. He just wanted to go around poking the bear.
Before I ask about your mom, and you guys, you're okay? Everybody's all right? I swear I took care of these. They're all set. You mentioned that your dad was taught Kamala Harris's father.
Yeah. Donald Harris was a student of his. We knew him somehow. Donald Harris told me this, not my dad, because my dad obviously had passed by the time Kamala became a big deal. But they were Donald Harris. My mom knows Donald Harris is from Brownstown, which is where my mom went to school. She knows. She went to school. She went to church at his father's church, and they clearly must have seen each other across a pew at the age of the degree of excitement in first of all, what's hilarious is there's one group that says Kamala Harris is black. Then there's another group that says she's Indian. And then there's the Jamaicans who are like, she's Jamaican.
Right.
And so the level of excitement among the Jamaicans over her is, my mother, literally, she's 93. There is zero chance she will exit this world between now and the election. Zero. It is not happening. The degree to which, and in her defense, I call her up. She the first 10 minutes is just defending Kamala against, they were attacking her for, her big thing is, they were attacking her for not revealing her positions. She's just started. How can she have positions before she's started? My mother's whole thing is this should unfold over the passage of time.
I remember I had the privilege of meeting her a few times, particularly in Washington, and she struck me as a very proper.
My mother is a very, very, yes, she is a very refined, dignified Jamaican lady. Yeah, nobody messes with. She also, she loved also confronting authority and did it endlessly and to great effect in our little town. They had never met.
How did she navigate rural Ontario?
She just sailed right in. She met all the kind of power brokers in town, charmed them, got on all the right committees. And, I mean, it was Mennonites. So the Mennonites they're the opposite end of they're
not racist.
There was no racism.
Yeah.
It was nothing. And also, it's a very different, now that I understand this, it's a very different story when you're the only black person in town.
How do you mean?
We'll actually talk about this in my book. An outsider is not threatening in those numbers, right? Particularly an outsider who is and this is a deeply Christian town, and my mother is a very devout woman. And so she seemed very familiar to them, even as she was, at the same time, in some sense, exotic. But she would never register, even if something untoward was done to her, she would never register that in the moment. Mm. She would hold it back, and she would tell you about it maybe later, but it wasn't and also, a lot of West Indians will tell you this, it's very different to come from a culture where you're in the majority. A story actually I told in Outliers. When my mom was she was a scholarship student at a boarding school in Jamaica, and all of the scholarship students were black, right? Mm-hmm. They would be. And they were all there because they were really good students. And so she's like 11 years old, and she reads in the Encyclopedia Britannica that black people are genetically inferior to white people when it comes to intelligence. And she can't comprehend this because in her world, all the smart people are
This was in the Britannica.
Yeah, this is like from 1900.
Yeah.
It's there, it's still in Jamaica in 1930, whatever. But in her world, all the smart people are black, and the dumb ones are the plantation owners' daughters. These white kids from, they're like, what are they doing here? And so it's like, if that's your mindset, when all you, so you come to Canada and you have no comprehension of the basis. You think of racism, you think of racist tropes as absurd as opposed to being malignant.
Malcolm, I want to thank you deeply for your work and your friendship. I miss you. You live in, like, God knows where, in upstate New York. I wish I saw you much more often.
Your idea of upstate New York is like Austining. That's about as far as you go. You're like, Esther and I are going away for the weekend. Where are you going?
Yonkers.
We're going to
Yonkers.
We're going to Yonkers.
What was your theory? What was the mountain Jews? I'm not a mountain Jew.
You're not a mountain
Jew. No, I'm really not.
No.
I'm an environmentalist because I want there to be a wonderful and healthy environment for you.
For you. No, you're an environmentalist because you've been told there is an environment out there.
Yeah, I check in with Betsy Colbert and Bill McKibben and others.
Yes.
And I'm told, like the other day, I was walking into my building and I heard this racket.
Yeah.
And I said, "What is that?" And the door guy said, "Those are birds." Evidently, this is a bad attitude. I want to close by asking you a very crucial question. You have an ambivalent relationship with sports. You once said, and I know you're a huge sports fan, Buffalo Bills, running, you're a terrific runner, but you've also said that sports are a moral abomination.
Did I say that?
You did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember. In what era of my?
I think your annoyance with professional sports.
Oh, yeah. Well, I do, so here's in a nutshell, my current thinking on this. I was a very good high school runner, and then I quit and didn't run for 30 years and then started again and became a kind of slightly better than mediocre.
Better than that, but okay.
But not.
Yeah.
When I was at 16, I was up here. When I was 50, I was down here. And I had way, way, way more fun when I was at 50 and mediocre than I did when I was 15 and a national champion. And it has made me realize that you want to be mediocre. You don't want to be good. It's that aside from the very, very small group of people who genuinely, if you're LeBron or you're Usain Bolt, fine. But the idea that the rest of us should be pursuing that kind of athletic excellence is a mistake. And what's happened, there is, I think, in the audience, a woman named Linda Flanagan, who wrote this book I adore called Taking Back the Game, which is this critique of what's gone wrong with youth sports. And this is, I think, one of her central arguments in this wonderful book, which really changed the way I think about it, which is that we've destroyed the very thing that made sports fun.
Play.
Mm-hmm. Right. By this kind of professionalizing of youth sports. And I realized that was my problem when I was 15. I was caught up in a fantasy about that I was going to go to the Olympics, and it ruined running for me. And I didn't run for 30 years, and that's heartbreaking because I love running more than almost anything else. And I recovered my joy of running only when I was coming in 28th in my local 5K. And so that's what I mean by like this. We shouldn't be, Linda would tell you, why are you taking a 13-year-old and putting them through
torturing them.
The torture and getting in a car and driving for 3 hours for like a soccer match? Why? The drive should never be longer than the match. That should be a rule, right?
Malcolm Gladwell, thank you. It's been a pleasure.